This is a chilling story about the power of manipulation. What began as love and trust turned into a tale of deception, exploitation, and murder, ultimately revealing a terrifying secret that shook the entire country to its core. Helge Fossmo was born on July 27, 1971, in the small village of Beberg, located in central Sweden. He was one of 5 children in a family that, interestingly, was not religious. In many cases, a person's interest in faith is shaped by the influence of family members or close friends. But Helge's spiritual curiosity developed independently. From a young age, he showed a fascination with religion, and at the age of 12, he joined the youth group of the local church community. While his parents did not share his religious interests, they were open-minded about his involvement in the church. They saw no harm in it and allowed their son to explore his faith. To them, it was a constructive outlet for a teenager, certainly better than other alternatives. Helge would later claim that his connection to the church was the moment his life truly began, describing the sense of salvation and purpose he found within its walls. Helge quickly distinguished himself among his peers. Even at a young age, he became one of the most dedicated and active members of the religious community. He attended every meeting and took part in church events with enthusiasm, building a reputation as a promising young Christian. This dedication continued over the next 5 years, solidifying his place in the congregation. In 1988, when he turned 17, Helge took a job at a cafe for Christian youth. It was there that he met his first love, a young woman named Helen Johansson. Their connection was immediate. Mutual affection grew quickly between them, and as soon as they reached adulthood, the two were married. They soon had 2 children together, and life in Beberg seemed stable and fulfilling. During this time, Helge continued to deepen his involvement in the church. His religious devotion only grew stronger, and before long, he had risen to the role of preacher in the local congregation. His life appeared to be on a straightforward and righteous path. However, in 1993, a meeting occurred that would dramatically alter the course of his life. Helge encountered a woman named Assa Waldow, who claimed to be the bride of Christ. Assa was the leader of a Christian sect that had begun to spread into their town. She was a charismatic figure, originally from the town of Kotby, where this particular doctrine had taken root. Assa traveled extensively, preaching and gathering new followers, especially targeting young people. Teenagers and young adults were particularly drawn to her teachings, which seemed to promise a deeper and more mystical connection to Christianity. This made Helge's family a prime target for her recruitment efforts. Assa had a unique strategy for drawing people into her sect. She would slowly convince individuals to detach from their existing family ties and join her religious community, a place where she promised they would find true spiritual fulfillment. When she first approached Helge, he did not immediately fall under her spell. Being a committed Christian and already a preacher himself, Helge was initially skeptical of her teachings. He was uncomfortable with the idea of a woman serving as a pastor, and he found some of her interpretations of Scripture to be too radical, even dangerous. He could sense that what she was promoting was more than just a new branch of Christianity. It was a cult, but Assa was not one to give up easily. She recognized Helge's potential as a valuable asset to her movement and became determined to win over both him and his family. Understanding that direct confrontation would not work, she adopted a more patient approach. Over the next several years, she worked steadily to gain the family's trust. She visited them regularly, offering what seemed like harmless spiritual advice, always careful not to push too hard or too fast. Her manipulation was slow and methodical, and over time, Helge began to soften. He became increasingly intrigued by her teachings, even as he harbored some lingering doubts. From 1993 to 1997, Assa's influence grew. During these years, she subtly planted seeds of doubt in Helge's mind about the traditional church. She pointed out what she saw as the flaws in mainstream Christian doctrine and portrayed her own movement as the true path to salvation. Helge, still seeking deeper spiritual fulfillment, gradually became more open to her ideas. Finally, in 1997, after 4 years of quiet persuasion, Assa managed to convince Helge and his family to join her sect. They decided to move to Kotby, where Assa's community was based. At first, the move seemed innocent enough. Assa presented the visit as a friendly invitation to see how her church operated. Once they arrived, however, the true nature of the sect became clearer. The town of Kotby was heavily centered around the church, and the sect had a significant following. Many of the town's residents were deeply involved in the church's activities, which went beyond simple religious services. The church was the heart of the community, providing jobs and roles for nearly all its members. The congregation was self-sufficient in many ways, with each individual having specific responsibilities, often related to religious activities. This structure created a strong sense of belonging and purpose for its members, which made it difficult for anyone to leave once they had become integrated. Helge was eager to assume the same role in Kotby that he had filled back in Beiberg, serving as the pastor of the new church and guiding the local congregation. However, soon after taking on his responsibilities, an unusual shift in his preaching style became apparent. His sermons began to take on increasingly radical and controversial themes. Unlike the more traditional sermons of his early days, which centered around standard Christian teachings, Helge's new messages often delved into topics that were considered taboo within the church community, such as intimacy and death. His interpretations of Scripture became far more provocative, often deviating from established norms. While some parishioners appreciated his fervor and charisma, many others were uncomfortable with the direction his teachings were taking. Despite their concerns, Helge remained committed to his new mission, driven by a sense of higher purpose. 2 years after moving to Kotby, the Fossmo family welcomed their third child. The arrival of a new baby brought added responsibilities and increased pressure on Helge and Helen. With the growing demands of caring for 3 children and Helge's intense focus on the church, the couple decided to hire a nanny. After a short search, they settled on a young woman named Sarah Svensson, who had recently moved to Kotby and was already inspired by Assa's teachings. As Sarah became more deeply integrated into the community, Helge's relationship with Assa also intensified. By this time, Helge and Assa had formed a close bond, spending countless hours together studying the scriptures and engaging in what they called divine conversations. They believed that they were receiving messages directly from God, which they interpreted as personal prophecies. Helge began keeping meticulous notes in his diary, documenting these supposed revelations, along with his emotions and interpretations of the visions. In one particularly striking vision, Helge claimed that God had declared him to be the King of Kings, while Assa was anointed as the Queen of Heaven. This profound revelation solidified Helge's belief that he was destined for greatness, and that his union with Assa was ordained by a divine plan. Assa, ever the manipulator, reinforced Helge's grand delusions. She convinced him that their spiritual connection required them to be together in a way that transcended earthly relationships. According to her, they needed to marry in order to form a holy union that would elevate their teachings and lead their followers to new spiritual heights. Despite his existing marriage to Helen, Helge fully embraced this idea, and in 1999, they held a symbolic wedding ceremony. In this private ritual, Helge gave Assa a ring adorned with 7 diamonds, each one symbolizing a sacred tenet of their faith. It was a gesture meant to represent their commitment to one another, not just as partners, but as leaders of their religious movement. Naturally, this so-called marriage created immense tension between Helge and Helen. Although the ceremony was symbolic and not legally binding, the emotional fallout was very real. Helen, still Helge's lawful wife, was consumed with jealousy and frustration. She had already felt her husband slipping away from her, his attention diverted entirely to Assa and the church, but this symbolic union between Helge and Assa pushed their relationship to the breaking point. Helen tried to express her anger and sorrow, but Assa quickly intervened, using her influence over Helge to control the situation. Assa attacked Helen's feelings of jealousy, labeling them as sinful and unworthy of a true Christian. She argued that jealousy was a vice, one that had no place in the heart of a devoted believer. Assa ramped up the pressure on Helen, threatening her with dire consequences if she didn't change her attitude. She even hinted that if Helen continued to resist, the church could turn against her, potentially leaving her and the children without a home. Faced with this intimidation, Helen felt trapped. Her attempts to hold on to her marriage were futile as Helgi grew increasingly distant and immersed in Assa's world. Helgi, consumed by his relationship with Assa, paid little attention to the needs of his family. His children and wife were no longer his priority. Instead, he focused all of his energy on his bond with Assa, whose approval and praise he craved. Assa, for her part, had no real desire to maintain a genuine romantic relationship with Helga. Her ultimate goal was not to form a loving union, but to assert control over him. She expertly manipulated Helgi's emotions, using their intimate relationship as a means to bend him to her will. Over time, she gained complete control over his actions, making Helgi almost entirely dependent on her for spiritual and emotional validation. Assa's manipulation grew even more insidious as she began to plant ideas in Helga's mind about his divine role in the world. She led him to believe that he had a special connection to Jesus, and that through him, the Son of God could manifest. As these ideas took hold, Helgi's behavior became increasingly erratic and disconnected from reality. His once structured and coherent sermons turned into bizarre displays of self-aggrandizement, filled with cryptic messages about his supposed divine mission. Tension had been brewing for some time in Kotby, particularly within the Fosmo household. By December 1999, an influenza epidemic had taken a heavy toll on the town, and the illness also swept through the Fosmo family. Helga, Helen, and their children were all affected, making it difficult to maintain the normal household routine. Much of the burden fell on their nanny, Sarah Svensson, who tirelessly cared for the children and kept the house in order while the family struggled with the illness. Despite the sickness, Helga and Helen did their best to carry on as usual, although the strain on their family dynamics was evident. On the morning of December 18, 1999, Helgi and Helen were at home, weakened by their flu symptoms. After breakfast, feeling particularly unwell, Helga decided to lie down and rest. It wasn't long before he drifted off into a deep sleep. Sometime later, Helgi was startled awake by a knock on the door. Groggy and disoriented, he got up to answer. It was their neighbor, concerned because he hadn't seen or heard from the Fosmos all day. The neighbor was particularly worried about Helen, as he had tried calling her name but received no response. Helga, though still sluggish from illness, assured the neighbor that everything was fine. However, the neighbor wasn't convinced and insisted on checking on Helen. Helga suddenly realized that it had been quite some time since Helen had gone to take a shower and hadn't yet come out. With growing concern, they rushed to the bathroom. As Helga pushed open the door, he was met with a horrifying sight. Helen was lying face down in the bathtub, fully clothed in the nightgown she had been wearing that morning. The tub was filled with water, and it was immediately clear something was terribly wrong. Helga's scream echoed through the house, loud enough to alert other neighbors who quickly rushed over to assist. Together, they pulled Helen's lifeless body from the tub and desperately tried to revive her. Despite their efforts, it was too late. Helen Fosmo, only 27 years old, was pronounced dead on the spot. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Helen's death was not as straightforward as it first appeared. A deep head injury was discovered during the examination, raising questions about how it had occurred. Experts speculated that Helen might have slipped in the bathroom, struck her head on the faucet, and then lost consciousness in the water, leading to her accidental drowning. However, there were several troubling inconsistencies. The toxicology report revealed that Helen had an extraordinarily high level of opioids in her system, enough to be fatal on its own. This was a disturbing find, as there was no record of Helen ever taking such strong drugs. How then had they entered her body? The presence of so many opioids suggested an insidious plan. But despite these red flags, law enforcement initially ruled the death accidental. According to the official conclusion, Helen had slipped, hit her head, and tragically drowned. Sarah Svensson, the family's nanny, corroborated this version of events, vouching for Helga and confirming that Helen had been alone in the bathroom. Her testimony played a significant role in persuading authorities to deem the death an unfortunate accident. At first, Helgi appeared to be a grieving widower, visibly devastated by the loss of his wife. He wept openly, and many in the community rallied around him in support. However, those who knew him better began to notice peculiarities in his behavior. For one, Helg wasted no time in clearing out all of Helen's belongings, almost as though he wanted to erase her existence. He refused to discuss her death, even with his children, forbidding them from mentioning their mother. To many, this behavior seemed suspicious, leading to rumors that Helen's death might not have been accidental at all. Some believed that Helga had orchestrated her demise to rid himself of an inconvenient wife, one who had grown distant and problematic, particularly after his symbolic marriage to Assa. There were also whispers that Helga had meddled with the investigation itself. Initially, he requested that no autopsy be conducted, citing religious reasons, but his request was denied due to the suspicious circumstances surrounding Helen's death. After the autopsy was completed, Helgi allegedly used his influence to have the report altered, particularly in regards to the opioid overdose. He claimed this was done to protect his wife's reputation and ensure she could rest in peace, free from the stain of accusations that might have painted her death as a suicide or drug overdose, both considered sinful acts in their religious community. Shortly after Helen's death, a strange shift occurred in Helga's personal life. Assa, the woman who had held such a powerful sway over him, abruptly lost interest. She left Kotby on one of her pilgrimages and never returned, cutting off ties with Helga without any clear explanation. Though their relationship had been intense and all-consuming, it appeared that Assa had no further use for Helga, leaving him to continue on the path she had set him on. However, Helga did not remain alone for long. Within a short period, he developed a new romantic relationship with none other than Assa's sister, Alexandra Waldow. Their courtship was swift, aided by Helga's status as a pastor and the respect he commanded within the community. Many parishioners viewed him as a deeply spiritual man, close to God, and this image undoubtedly helped win Alexandra over. By the spring of 2000, Alexandra had moved into the Fosmo household, and before long, the two were married. Yet even this new marriage did not seem to satisfy Helga. Despite having a new wife, his desires only seemed to grow. By the spring of 2001, Helga had turned his attention to Sarah Svensson, the family's nanny, and began actively flirting with her. At this point in time, Sarah Svensson continued to work in Helga Fosmo's household, maintaining her role as the family's nanny. However, her relationship with the pastor had shifted dramatically. What had once been a professional relationship became a deeply personal one, especially after Helga began to show her affection and attention. By the time Helga's relationship with his second wife, Alexandra Waldow, began to unravel, his affair with Sarah grew more intense. Sarah, watching all of this unfold, tried to support her lover in any way she could. She became his confidant, someone who sympathized with his struggles and offered solace during the difficult times. Helga, ever the manipulator, took full advantage of Sarah's compassion, often inviting her to the church for joint prayers. It was during these supposed spiritual gatherings that Helga's manipulation took on a more physical form, as he regularly inclined Sarah toward intimacy under the guise of divine union. Helgi, always the eloquent speaker, insisted that their physical relationship was not about lust or personal gratification. Instead, he claimed that it was part of a higher spiritual calling, a sacred act that was a direct message to God. In these moments, Helgi convinced Sarah that through their union, they were channeling divine energy, merging their souls in a way that transcended earthly desires. Sarah, deeply enamored with Helgi and eager to serve God as she believed Helgi instructed, accepted these explanations without question. By this point, Sarah adored Helge Fosmo to such an extent that she accepted his every word without hesitation. She believed his stories, his prophecies, and his divine visions were true and necessary for her own spiritual growth. In her mind, these moments with Helgi were filled with a sense of divine inspiration. She believed she was acting righteously, fulfilling God's will by following Helgi's commands. However, unbeknownst to her, she had fallen into the trap of a manipulative man who used religion and spiritual rhetoric to disguise his own desires and ambitions. As their relationship progressed, Helge began to introduce even more disturbing ideas. He started preaching that he was a warrior for God, a chosen vessel through which divine battles were fought on earth. According to Helge, his mission was not an easy one. He claimed that obstacles, people or situations, sometimes had to be removed for the greater good. While he often spoke in riddles, these cryptic statements were meant to prepare Sarah for what was to come. Sarah, deeply under his influence, believed every word, interpreting these ominous hints as divine messages that needed to be followed. Helge then began telling Sarah that during his moments of intimacy with Alexandra, he received messages from God. These messages, he claimed, foretold that Alexandra's time on earth was coming to an end. Helge framed it as an inevitable part of God's plan, suggesting that Alexandra's departure from this world was necessary for the divine order to continue. He told Sarah that he had seen a vision of his perfect partner, and it was none other than Sarah herself. Furthermore, Helge planted the idea in Sarah's mind that if his marriage to Alexandra was not ended soon, he might die as a result of some cosmic imbalance. Divorce was out of the question due to their strict religious beliefs. So Helge began to imply that more drastic measures were needed to break the union. Helge also convinced Sarah that in order to fight the demons that plagued their community, she needed to live in his home permanently. Although he was still married to Alexandra, Sarah moved into the household where the two women lived in separate rooms. Helge took turns having intimate encounters with each woman, framing these actions as rituals necessary for fighting spiritual darkness. He claimed that these encounters were not acts of physical desire, but were instead sacred practices to cleanse and purify both women and himself of any demonic influences. His eloquence and religious rhetoric convinced them that they were participating in holy battles against the forces of evil. Helge's manipulation of Sarah reached its peak during this period. He no longer spent time with her unless it was for intimate encounters. The rest of the time, he berated her, breaking down her self-esteem until she was entirely dependent on him for validation. Every time he humiliated her, he would end with the words, "I love you." These small moments of affection, however manipulative, were enough to keep Sarah completely enthralled. She lived for these rare moments, craving Helge's approval and believing that she was fulfilling God's will. By the time Sarah was completely under Helge's control, she had lost all sense of autonomy. Her thoughts, actions, and desires were no longer her own. She had become a puppet in the hands of a dangerous man, one who used religion and spiritual manipulation to satisfy his own needs and advance his twisted agenda. As Helge's hold over her tightened, it became increasingly clear that he had set the stage for something far more sinister, something that would soon have devastating consequences for all involved. As the tension between Helge Fossmo and his second wife, Alexandra, continued to escalate, Helge began to plant dangerous ideas in Sarah Svensson's mind. His manipulations had been gradual, but now he was becoming more direct in his approach, asking her repeatedly if she would be willing to kill in the name of the Lord. Though she was not yet prepared to take such a drastic step, her resistance weakened with each conversation. Sensing this, Helge decided to escalate his manipulative tactics. He knew he needed to push her further along the path to total submission, and so he devised a sinister plan. The pastor created a new account on a messaging platform, which he used to send Sarah messages from what appeared to be an unknown number. Posing as the voice of God, Helge's messages took on an ominous tone, instructing Sarah that her time was running out. According to these supposed divine instructions, she was to perform a sacred task, an execution in the name of the Lord, by no later than November 25th. At first, Sarah suspected that Helge was behind the messages, but when she confronted him, he vehemently denied any involvement. His anger at her doubt only deepened her confusion, and once again, he turned to his most effective tactic, shaming her for her lack of faith. He accused her of sinfulness and of failing to trust in God's plan, manipulating her emotions until she was overwhelmed with guilt. Sarah, desperate to prove her devotion, reluctantly accepted the messages as divine. As time passed, the messages from God grew more insistent and disturbing. The fake deity now claimed that Sarah was a critical part of a divine plan, one that required her to send souls back to heaven. The manipulation took a toll on Sarah's already fragile psyche, and soon she found herself seriously contemplating the idea of murder as a means to save her soul. In her mind, the weight of eternal salvation and damnation hung in the balance, and she began to feel that carrying out this gruesome act was her only path to redemption. The breaking point came on November 8, 2003. That morning, Alexandra Fosmo awoke in her own bed to the horrifying sight of Sarah Svensson standing over her, wielding a hammer. Sarah, driven by the belief that she was carrying out God's will, brutally attacked Alexandra, striking her repeatedly. Miraculously, Alexandra managed to survive the vicious assault and fend off her attacker, but the reason behind the attack was chilling. Sarah later claimed that she had received another message from God via the Messenger app, instructing her to kill the pastor's wife immediately. Despite the severity of the crime, Sarah faced no legal consequences. Helge Fosmo, using his influence and manipulative skills, insisted that the incident be kept quiet, and there was no official police report. The entire situation was hushed up, and as a form of punishment, Helge sent Sarah away, forcing her to live with her father. However, even this banishment did not end the dark chapter. Sarah continued to receive messages from the so-called God, and these correspondences only fueled her growing conviction that she was carrying out a righteous mission. Helge, meanwhile, could not stay away from his former lover for long. Despite everything that had transpired, he quickly began an affair with a new woman, Annette Lind, the wife of a man named Daniel Linde. This new romantic entanglement only complicated matters further, as Helge now saw Daniel as an obstacle to be removed. Once again, he employed the same tactics that had worked so well on Sarah in the past, sending her messages supposedly from God and convincing her that Daniel's removal was a necessary part of her divine mission. Sarah, still eager to save her soul and prove her devotion, reluctantly agreed to carry out another act of violence. Helge, who now exercised complete control over Sarah, orchestrated every detail of the plan. After the failed attempt on Alexandra's life, Helge gave Sarah another chance to prove herself. This time, however, Sarah prepared much more carefully. She acquired a gun and studied instructions for making a silencer, ensuring that her second attempt at fulfilling God's will would be successful. On the night of January 10, 2004, Sarah Svensson set out to execute the grim plan. She borrowed her father's car and, in constant contact with Helge, drove to the neighborhood where the Fosmo family lived. She arrived at 3:30 in the morning, fully prepared for what was to come. By now, 23-year-old Alexandra Fosmo was still living in Helge's home, blissfully unaware of the deadly danger that awaited her. Sarah parked the car a safe distance away, 500 meters from the house, and disguised herself carefully. She wore a black mask, different-sized shoes to throw off the police, and wrapped her feet in tight plastic bags to avoid leaving any footprints. The front door to the house had already been tampered with. Helge had broken the lock earlier to stage the scene as a robbery. Once inside, Sarah crept silently into Alexandra's bedroom, where the young woman was fast asleep. Without hesitation, Sarah shot Alexandra in the thigh. Alexandra awoke with a scream, only to be silenced by a second shot to the head. With Alexandra dead, Sarah proceeded to her second target, Daniel Lind, Annette's husband. At 4:30 a.m., Sarah made her way to Daniel Lind's house. Helge had informed her in advance that Daniel would be home alone that night. When Sarah arrived, she found the door locked and simply knocked. When Daniel, unsuspecting of the danger, opened the door, Sarah immediately shot him in the chest. As he fell to the floor, she fired another shot at his head, believing the job was done. Satisfied with her work, Sarah fled the scene. However, Daniel miraculously survived the attack. Despite his injuries, he managed to reach a phone and call for help. When the police arrived, Daniel was able to give a partial description of his attacker, though the mask Sarah wore obscured her identity. During this period, Helge Fossmo, a 32-year-old pastor with a reputation for piety and spiritual leadership, quickly inserted himself into the aftermath of the horrific events, playing the role of a concerned and supportive neighbor. When Daniel Linde was rushed to the hospital after surviving Sarah Svensson's attack, Helge Fossmo accompanied him, carefully maintaining the facade of a deeply empathetic man. In the hospital, he learned the grim news that his wife, Alexandra Fossmo, had been murdered. Throughout this ordeal, Helge displayed the demeanor of a grief-stricken husband, skillfully masking his darker intentions behind a veil of sorrow and concern. His ability to manipulate situations and people had become a deadly skill. Despite the confusion surrounding the attacks, the investigation quickly began to focus on Sarah Svensson. Neighbors and acquaintances recalled the bizarre and unresolved incidents surrounding Helge's first wife, who had died under mysterious circumstances years earlier. Moreover, the brutal hammer attack on Alexandra Fossmo, which had been kept under wraps due to Helge's influence, was finally uncovered by the police, casting further suspicion on those connected to the pastor. At the scene of Alexandra's murder and Daniel Linde's attempted murder, bloody fingerprints were found. These prints, unmistakably belonging to Sarah Svensson, became irrefutable evidence of her involvement in both crimes. The 26-year-old nanny was promptly arrested, and though she initially insisted that she had acted alone, without any external pressure, she eventually broke down under questioning. Sarah confessed that she believed she was acting in the name of God, having been manipulated by divine messages that had instructed her to carry out the murders. As part of the investigation, Sarah Svensson's cell phone was seized. The police quickly discovered Helge Fossmo's number among her contacts, as well as another number belonging to an unidentified individual. However, no incriminating messages were found on this phone. The real breakthrough came when a second phone was uncovered, which held a trove of over 1,000 messages exchanged between Sarah and the person she believed to be God. These texts revealed a chilling pattern of manipulation, coercing her into believing that her actions were part of a divine mission. It didn't take long for investigators to trace the unknown number back to none other than Helge Fossmo. This revelation shattered Sarah, as she had truly believed that she had been communicating with the Almighty. The realization that her beloved pastor had deceived her with such cruel precision was a devastating blow. Once faced with the overwhelming truth, Sarah fully cooperated with the authorities. She recounted the entire saga of manipulation, detailing how Helge Fossmo had coerced her into committing the crimes. During the trial, a crime reconstruction video was presented in which Sarah Svensson vividly described how she had carried out the murders. This recording, initially believed to be a full account of the events, later raised significant questions. A private investigation revealed that the original 6-hour version of the video had been edited, with crucial portions omitted from the version shown to the court. This revelation led some to question whether Sarah had been fully responsible for the murders, or whether Helge himself had played a more direct role, cleverly shifting the blame to his manipulated accomplice. Despite these lingering doubts, Sarah Svensson was declared legally insane and committed to a psychiatric hospital following the trial. Sarah remained in treatment for several years, undergoing extensive therapy for the psychological trauma she had endured and the severe manipulation she had been subjected to. In 2011, after completing her treatment and being deemed safe for society, Sarah was released from the psychiatric institution. Throughout the trial, Helge Fossmo remained cold and unrepentant. His arrogance was palpable as he continuously denied any involvement, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge the role he had played in orchestrating the tragic events. Psychiatrists examined Fossmo and found him sane, though they were astonished by the extent of his manipulative behavior. The prosecution, however, presented an airtight case, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Helge had incited the murder of his wife, Alexandra, and the attempted murder of Daniel Linde. In July 2004, Helge Fossmo was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 24 years. Despite several appeals, all of which were denied, Fossmo remains incarcerated to this day. In an interview in August 2006, while still imprisoned, Fosmo finally confessed to his role in Alexandra's murder and the attempt on Daniel Linde's life. While in prison, Helga Fosmo's life took yet another bizarre turn. In 2007, he married for a third time, though the identity of his new wife has remained a mystery. In 2020, Assa Waldow, who had once been a close associate of Helge Fosmo, was convicted on 8 counts of crimes related to attacks on former members of the church. Waldow was sentenced to community service, and following her conviction, she changed her last name, distanced herself from church activities, and retreated from public life. Daniel Linde, who had miraculously survived his near-fatal encounter with Sarah Svensson, eventually recovered from his injuries. However, the traumatic events left a lasting impact on him. Fearing the ongoing influence of the local church and its more extreme members, Daniel chose not to return to his hometown, instead opting to rebuild his life elsewhere, away from the place that had brought him so much suffering. A chilling story unfolded in a quiet suburban area. There were threats, warnings, strange behavior, and moments of anxious tension. The crime was so brutal and calculated that it shocked even the most experienced investigators. The case was so complex that it hit a dead end several times. The terrible consequences of this tragedy will leave indelible marks. Marriage is a union that carries profound consequences not only for the couple, but also for their families and communities. When people get married, what starts as a promising journey can easily devolve into a tragic scenario worthy of crime headlines. On the fateful morning of November 27, 2017, the sheriff's office in Coffee County, Alabama, received a deeply unsettling report. A witness had come forward with information about what appeared to be a suicide. Police were dispatched to a residence owned by a local church, a house that had long been used by the community, but was now being rented out to congregation members. Living there was Sarah Starr, a recently divorced mother of 4 young children. Sarah Starr was born in 1979 in the small, humble town of Colby, Kansas. From a very young age, Sarah exhibited a natural affinity for understanding people, especially children. Her ability to connect with them led her to pursue a career in education, specifically teaching literature and writing at a local elementary school. After completing her degree at the University of Kansas, Sarah embarked on her teaching career. Her passion for literature was evident to her students, and those who interacted with her were quick to notice her empathy and gentle nature. People who knew her described her as not only a caring teacher, but also a person whose calm demeanor brought out the best in others, be it in the classroom or in more personal settings. Her life seemed poised for contentment, but as we will see, circumstances can shift dramatically. Sarah had married Jason in February 2001, when she was 22, and Jason was 28. At the time, Sarah had just finished her studies and had obtained her degree in education. Jason, a military veteran, had recently returned to civilian life and was trying to find his footing in the working world. His courtship was short-lived. Sarah, enchanted by Jason's strength and charm, thought she had found a partner for life. Jason, on the other hand, had already been through one failed marriage, from which he had a son. Despite his past, Sarah was determined to make their marriage work, confident that love could overcome any challenges they might face. For a few years, things seemed relatively stable. Jason found work, and Sarah supported him emotionally, focusing on building a home and family. Yet as time went on, cracks began to show in their relationship, cracks that would only deepen with the arrival of their children. 4 years into their marriage, Sarah and Jason welcomed twins. While Sarah was overjoyed, Jason's reaction was more muted. He struggled with the responsibilities of fatherhood, and as the couple's financial pressures mounted, his patience wore thin. A second set of twins was born 5 years later, adding even more strain to an already struggling household. For Sarah, however, becoming a mother of 4 was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. She adored her children and threw herself wholeheartedly into motherhood. Jason, on the other hand, became more distant and irritable. Their marriage was deteriorating, but Sarah, ever the optimist, tried to hold things together for the sake of her children. They relocated to Coffee County, Alabama, in hopes that a change of scenery might improve their fortunes. Jason started a new job and even ventured into starting his own business, while Sarah took on the role of a full-time housewife, managing the household and caring for 4 young children. Despite her love for her family, Sarah found the responsibilities overwhelming. The demands of raising 4 children, maintaining the home, and trying to manage a part-time job left her physically and emotionally drained. Jason's new business was not doing as well as they had hoped, and his mood swings became more volatile. Publicly, he was dismissive and often cruel, belittling Sarah in front of others. In private, the emotional abuse worsened. Sarah's friends began to notice the toll this was taking on her, though she tried to downplay her struggles, insisting that things would get better. But it was becoming increasingly clear that their marriage was not what it appeared to be. In time, Sarah found solace in the local Baptist church, quickly becoming an integral part of the congregation. Her kind-heartedness, sociability, and infectious sense of humor made her a beloved member of the congregation. She also had hobbies such as gardening and photography, which brought her moments of peace amidst the turbulence of her personal life. By 2016, Sarah was teaching 4th grade at a local elementary school, where her colleagues spoke highly of her. They described her as upbeat and cheerful, a positive presence in the school. Despite her outward cheer, Sarah's home life remained a constant source of stress and sorrow. Jason often berated Sarah for the chaos that naturally comes with raising 4 young children. The noise, the mess, and the demands of parenthood seemed to wear on him, particularly after the birth of their second set of twins. The family had grown larger, but instead of viewing the children as blessings, Jason began to resent them, seeing them as a heavy burden rather than an extension of their love. This shift in his attitude worsened the already toxic environment in their home. Sarah realized that the relationship was no longer sustainable, but like many trapped in unhealthy marriages, she felt there was no way out. Financially, she had been dependent on Jason for years, and with 4 children to support, the idea of leaving seemed daunting. However, as soon as she secured her teaching position, Sarah saw a glimmer of hope for financial independence. The strength to leave Jason grew in her, and she began to envision a life without his constant emotional abuse. Even though she knew the road ahead would be difficult, what with dividing their property, sharing custody of the children, and untangling their financial ties, Sarah felt that the time had come to escape. She moved out of their home, renting a small house provided by the church, and filed for divorce. What followed was a grueling 2-year legal battle that took a toll on her mental health and emotional well-being. During the divorce process, Jason was relentless in his criticisms of Sarah. According to him, she was constantly under stress, and one of his chief complaints was her so-called frivolous spending. He accused Sarah of being a shopaholic, spending his hard-earned money on unnecessary items. Sarah did indeed face financial difficulties after separating from Jason, but this was largely because she had been left to support her children with minimal resources. Thankfully, the church community rallied around her during these tough times, offering her emotional and financial support. Despite everything, Sarah remained a loving and attentive mother. Her dedication to her children never wavered, and she managed to juggle her parental responsibilities while maintaining her job as a teacher. Still, the pressures of life weighed heavily on Sarah. Her mental health was deteriorating, and she found herself more and more anxious. She often quarreled with Jason during their encounters, struggled with insomnia, and showed signs of mild depression. Yet despite her fragile state, she refused to seek professional help, preferring to rely on antidepressants rather than engaging with a therapist. Her decision to avoid therapy reflected her deep-seated fear of vulnerability, perhaps a lasting effect of the emotional abuse she had endured during her marriage. When it finally came time to move out of the house she had shared with Jason, Sarah enlisted the help of her close friends Dana and Lawrence. They noticed that she was unusually nervous throughout the process. Sarah seemed frantic, rushing to pack her belongings, often forgetting things and having to return to the house multiple times. It was clear to Dana and Lawrence that something was deeply unsettling her. The most alarming part of the day was Sarah's constant fear that Jason might show up unannounced. She expressed a genuine terror of seeing him again, as if she expected some kind of confrontation. As it turned out, Jason did arrive, though not at the house they were vacating, but at Sarah's new place. When he appeared, Sarah bolted inside, clearly shaken by his presence. Lawrence, acting as a protective barrier, met Jason at the doorstep and asked him to leave. To their relief, Jason complied, though he lingered for a while before finally departing. Inside, Sarah was trembling, on the verge of a breakdown. She confided in Dana and Lawrence that she was convinced Jason had come to harm her. His previous threats to hurt her if she ever left him echoed in her mind, and this fear had been consuming her since the separation. Even after Jason had gone, Sarah remained on edge, her hands shaking, her voice unsteady. It took hours for her to calm down. This unsettling encounter occurred early in the separation, but the fear it instilled in Sarah lingered for years. Finally, after 2 agonizing years, the divorce was settled. According to the terms of the agreement, the custody of the children was divided between Sarah and Jason, with each parent responsible for 2 of the twins. Jason was also required to pay Sarah $3,500 a month in child support and spousal maintenance. This amount, while vital to Sarah's ability to care for her children, significantly impacted Jason's finances, as it represented more than half of his monthly income. Despite this, Sarah did not gain any rights to Jason's business or other assets. She continued to live in the modest house provided by the church, while Jason relocated to a nearby home, moving in with his elderly mother. Living just a short distance from Jason added to Sarah's ongoing anxiety. Even though the divorce was finalized, she never felt fully free of him. His presence, both physical and emotional, loomed large in her life. Every interaction they had, whether about the children, finances, or logistical arrangements, rekindled the fear and tension that had defined their marriage. For Sarah, the divorce had ended the legal ties between them, but the emotional wounds remained wide open. Despite the court's ruling, the shadow of Jason's anger and control continued to darken her new life, leaving her to wonder whether she would ever truly be free of him. On the morning of November 27, 2017, something tragic and unexpected unfolded that would change the lives of many people. Sarah Starr, a beloved teacher and devoted mother of 4, was supposed to return to work following the Thanksgiving holiday. Her colleagues, accustomed to her punctuality and dependability, became increasingly concerned when she didn't show up to her classroom. Attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered, and her absence was met with growing anxiety. It was completely out of character for Sarah to disappear without notifying anyone, particularly when it came to her responsibilities at the school. As the minutes ticked by, the staff's unease grew, and one of her colleagues, fearing something was terribly wrong, decided to check on her personally. Their worst fears were confirmed. Around 8:30 a.m., Sarah was found lying in a pool of blood in the driveway outside her home. The sight was horrifying and made their blood run cold. Emergency services were immediately called to the scene, but it was clear that her injuries were catastrophic. At first, some thought Sarah might have taken her own life, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of single motherhood and the trauma of her recent divorce. However, even a brief examination by the authorities indicated otherwise. It was clear that this was not a suicide. Sarah had been brutally attacked. The forensic examination revealed that Sarah had left her house at around 6:30 a.m., presumably on her way to work. But before she could even reach her car, she was gunned down. The assailant had used a shotgun, firing from nearly point-blank range. One shot struck her in the chest, while a second, devastating blast hit her in the head. The attack was vicious, cold-blooded, and clearly premeditated. Despite the severity of the crime, there were few immediate clues. The rural setting of Sarah's home meant that neighbors, though hearing gunshots, hadn't thought much of it. In such areas, it wasn't uncommon to hear gunfire, as people frequently used weapons for hunting or to scare off wildlife. As a result, the gunshots that killed Sarah were dismissed as part of the rural soundscape. There were no fingerprints, no tire tracks, and no witnesses who had seen the killer. The only thing investigators had to go on was Sarah's recent bitter divorce from her ex-husband, Jason Starr. Given the circumstances, Jason quickly became the prime suspect. Jason and Sarah's marriage had been troubled, with years of emotional abuse culminating in their divorce, which had only been finalized a few months before Sarah's death. Sarah had confided in close friends, including Dana and Lawrence, who had helped her move out of the house she shared with Jason. They confirmed to police that Sarah had been living in fear of her ex-husband, especially after the divorce settlement required Jason to pay substantial alimony and child support. Sarah had often expressed her belief that Jason might seek revenge, fearing that he would lash out due to the financial strain the divorce put on him. The proximity of Jason's new residence, just a few minutes' walk from Sarah's rented church house, only heightened suspicions. It seemed almost too coincidental that Sarah had been killed shortly after a contentious divorce, and with Jason living so close by, it was natural for investigators to consider him the most likely culprit. He was quickly brought in for questioning. Jason, however, denied any involvement in Sarah's murder. He told investigators that on the morning of the shooting, he had been at a local restaurant, eating breakfast with his children. To the disappointment of law enforcement, Jason's alibi was corroborated by security footage and witness testimony. After hours of interrogation, he was released, though detectives remained unconvinced of his innocence. Even if he hadn't pulled the trigger himself, they speculated that Jason might have orchestrated the attack. Perhaps he had hired someone to kill Sarah, motivated by the financial burden of the divorce and his ongoing resentment towards his ex-wife. These suspicions lingered, but without concrete evidence, the investigation hit a wall. Jason's release did little to quell the growing tension surrounding the case. Although his alibi seemed solid, those closest to Sarah remained convinced that he was somehow involved. After all, Sarah had no known enemies, no connections to the criminal underworld, and no history of dangerous associations. Her murder seemed personal, and the most obvious motive belonged to Jason. Yet proving his involvement was another matter entirely. Over the following months, the investigation dragged on with few developments. The local police, lacking significant leads, continued to keep a close watch on Jason, hoping that something would slip through the cracks. By January 2018, despite their efforts, no new evidence emerged. In an attempt to reignite public interest in the case, a press conference was held. The state governor announced a $5,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of Sarah's killer. An additional $500 was later contributed by a concerned townsperson. Unfortunately, these efforts did not yield results. A handful of tips came in, but each one was investigated and ultimately dismissed as irrelevant. With the investigation stalled, Sarah's children were placed into the custody of social services. This decision was made due to lingering concerns about Jason's integrity and whether it was safe for the children to remain in his care. As a result, Jason's relationship with his children became increasingly strained, further complicating his life in the wake of the tragedy. As months turned into years, the case grew colder. Despite occasional statements from law enforcement and renewed appeals for information, Sarah's murder remained unsolved. Local police were joined by state law enforcement agencies in their efforts to find justice for Sarah, but every lead they pursued eventually fizzled out. By that point, public interest had waned, and the community had started to lose hope that Sarah's killer would ever be brought to justice. Yet, for Sarah's family, friends, and the many people whose lives she had touched, the memory of that horrific morning in 2017 remained painfully fresh. The question that haunted them all was simple. Would Sarah ever find the justice she deserved, or would her tragic death remain a mystery forever? It wasn't easy for the detectives to establish a clear connection between Jason Starr and his ex-wife's murder, but they were increasingly convinced that he was involved. Although Jason had a solid alibi for the morning of Sarah's death, he had been having breakfast with his children at a local restaurant. This didn't entirely absolve him of suspicion. The investigators theorized that if Jason didn't commit the crime himself, he might have hired someone to do it. Financial pressure provided a strong motive. After the divorce, Jason was ordered to pay over half of his income, $3,500 out of a $6,300 monthly salary. in alimony and child support. This situation was an obvious source of resentment for him. Jason had tried and failed to gain full custody of his children in order to avoid these payments, which only intensified his frustrations. It wasn't until December 2021, 4 long years after Sarah's death, that the investigation saw any renewed attention. While investigating Jason's personal life, police examined his computer and discovered a mass of documents that shed new light on his state of mind. The files appeared to be part of a draft for a book Jason had been writing for years. In these writings, he vented his anger over the court's decision, bitterly resenting the financial obligations imposed on him. His notes were filled with degrading comments about Sarah and women in general. The tone was aggressive and demeaning, and while there was no explicit mention of a plan to kill Sarah, his contempt for her was evident. The more detectives read, the clearer it became that Jason harbored a deep, festering hatred for his ex-wife. These writings only bolstered the investigators' suspicions. The investigation took a significant turn when detectives began scrutinizing Jason's financial transactions. They discovered a series of 7 payments totaling $2,600, all made between September 7th and November 15th, 2017. These transactions were sent to a woman named Lily, a person Jason had no known prior relationship with. The investigation revealed that Lily was a friend of Jason's brother, Darren. Curiously, before September 7th, there had been no contact or financial exchanges between Jason and Lily. This sudden flurry of payments raised red flags, leading the detectives to dig deeper into this connection. When the police interviewed Lily, they uncovered another peculiar detail. Jason had given his brother Darren a 2016 model motorcycle, an expensive gift that seemed out of place considering Jason's tight financial situation. When questioned about this, Jason claimed that the motorcycle had been damaged in an accident and that he hadn't wanted to go through the insurance process. Instead, he said, he gave the bike to Darren to repair. According to Jason, Darren had estimated the repairs would cost $5,000, and the $2,600 in payments was supposed to help cover the cost of the parts. However, the fact that Jason sent this money through Lily rather than directly to Darren seemed odd. Jason offered no explanation for why he chose to involve a woman he barely knew in this financial arrangement. The detectives weren't buying Jason's story. The use of Lily as an intermediary looked suspicious, as though Jason were trying to conceal the true nature of these transactions. While Jason maintained that the money was meant to help repair the motorcycle, the police believed it was more likely that these payments were part of a scheme to fund Sarah's murder. Darren or Lily, or both, might have been involved in the killing, with Lily acting as a front to throw investigators off the trail. This theory was bolstered by the discovery that Darren had been in Alabama, near Sarah's home, in the days leading up to her death. Darren was not an easy man to track down. Described as a loner with a rough personality, he lived a largely isolated life in a trailer in Texas. He had a history of minor criminal activity, including a 2013 arrest for drug possession. When Darren had been pulled over for speeding that year, a police dog had alerted the officers to drugs in the vehicle. A subsequent search revealed various narcotics and equipment for their manufacture. Although Darren's drug charges resulted in a relatively lenient sentence, his criminal record painted a picture of a man with a penchant for crime. The detectives now faced a critical question. Was Darren capable of murder? They began to look more closely at his relationship with Jason, examining text messages, phone records, and other communications. As they pieced together Darren's movements in the days leading up to Sarah's murder, they found disturbing evidence. On November 18, 2017, just days before Sarah was killed, Darren had arrived in Coffee County, Alabama. He stayed in the area for 10 days, during which time he was frequently seen near the house Sarah rented from the church. The most damning piece of evidence came from cell phone records. Darren's phone had been turned off for several hours on the night before the murder, a common tactic used to avoid being tracked. When his phone was finally switched back on, it was around 10 a.m. the next day, and Darren was already back in Texas. This timing aligned perfectly with the murder, as Sarah had been shot early in the morning, between 6:30 and 7 a.m. The fact that Darren had been in the vicinity of Sarah's home and had turned off his phone suggested that he had something to hide. It seemed increasingly likely that Darren had carried out the murder, possibly at Jason's behest. Investigators began to zero in on Darren as the primary suspect, though they still couldn't rule out the possibility that Jason had orchestrated the entire plot. Jason's financial struggles, his bitter writings about Sarah, and the suspicious money transfers all pointed to his involvement in some capacity. Darren's sudden appearance in Alabama, coupled with his evasive behavior, made him a prime suspect in Sarah's killing. But proving that either of them was directly responsible for her death would require more evidence. As the case continued to unfold, it became clear that this was not just a story of a bitter divorce gone wrong. It was a tale of greed, anger, and revenge, with both Jason and Darren playing key roles in a conspiracy that led to the brutal murder of a mother of 4. The detectives were determined to get to the bottom of it, but they knew that proving Jason and Darren's guilt would be a long and arduous process. On the evening of November 27, the same day Sarah was murdered, Darren sent his brother Jason a cryptic message. It read like a coded communication, referencing the success of a deer hunt. To the detectives, it became clear that the brothers were communicating in code to conceal their involvement in Sarah's murder. A neighbor had even reported seeing a motorcycle near Sarah's house multiple times in the days leading up to the crime. The description of the motorcycle matched one Darren owned, and others in the neighborhood had also noticed this vehicle, but no one thought much of it at the time. The final piece of evidence came from a surveillance camera attached to a barn near Sarah's house. Just minutes after the crime, the camera caught a glimpse of the same motorcycle speeding away from the scene. Based on this mounting evidence, the detectives concluded that Jason had hired his brother to kill Sarah. On December 1, 2021, both Jason and Darren were formally charged with the murder. Jason, when arrested, behaved arrogantly, demanding a lawyer and dismissing the charges with an air of confidence. He repeatedly denied any involvement, stating that the police had no case against him. Jason was later released on bail pending trial, with an ankle bracelet placed on his body to track his movements. His trial was scheduled for June 27, 2022. Darren's situation was far more complicated. Unlike his brother, Darren fled, and the FBI took charge of the manhunt. Darren was added to the federal wanted list, with his photo circulated nationwide. Authorities offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to his capture, which was later raised to $225,000, showing the seriousness of the case. After a 2-month-long manhunt, Darren finally surrendered to authorities in Texas on February 5, 2022. He maintained his innocence and refused to be placed under house arrest, opting instead to stay in prison while awaiting trial. Throughout this period, Darren and Jason continued communicating via phone, though their conversations were carefully monitored by law enforcement. Despite the wiretaps, neither brother said anything particularly incriminating. The lack of direct evidence against Darren led to delays in the case, as the prosecution struggled to build a solid case against him. Darren's defense team capitalized on this, arguing that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. During the pretrial phase, Darren's lawyer repeatedly attempted to shift suspicion away from the brothers by proposing alternative suspects. However, each of these leads was quickly debunked by the police, who found no evidence linking these individuals to the crime. Eventually, the court barred any further mention of these supposed suspects, citing a state law that prohibited the implication of third parties in a crime without strong evidence. By September 11, 2023, nearly 6 years after Sarah's murder, the trials for both Jason and Darren finally began. The prolonged delays had frustrated the community, which had been following the case closely. The prosecution's case rested heavily on Jason's financial motives. The state presented evidence that Jason had been struggling to meet the court-ordered alimony and child support payments, which amounted to more than half his monthly income. His resentment over these financial obligations, coupled with his animosity towards Sarah, created a compelling motive. The prosecution argued that Jason's bitterness toward his ex-wife had driven him to conspire with his brother Darren to eliminate her. They laid out the chain of events: Jason's transfer of money to Darren, his coded messages, and the suspicious use of Lily, a distant acquaintance, to funnel funds. They also noted that Darren had been in Alabama at the time of the murder and was seen near Sarah's home, tying him to the crime scene. The prosecutor's case was bolstered by the peculiar behavior of both Jason and Darren. Jason had sent money to Darren through Lily, despite having no ongoing relationship with her, and neither brother had communicated with her before or after the crime. This led prosecutors to argue that the brothers had used Lily as a conduit to hide their financial transactions. Though Lily was initially implicated as an accomplice, she was able to clear her name by insisting that she had no knowledge of the crime. She claimed she had simply facilitated the financial transfers without understanding their true purpose. Her shock at being considered a potential accomplice led the prosecutors to drop any charges against her. The defense, on the other hand, tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They argued that the police had rushed to judgment and had no solid evidence linking the brothers to Sarah's death. The defense team highlighted the absence of direct proof. The murder weapon was never found, there were no eyewitnesses to the crime, and the surveillance footage only showed a motorcycle driving away from the scene. It didn't capture the murder itself. Furthermore, Jason's bitter writings about Sarah, which the prosecution used as evidence of his intent, were framed by the defense as nothing more than emotional outbursts from a man struggling with the financial strain of a divorce. The defense argued that Jason's anger and frustration were not proof of a criminal conspiracy, but rather the natural reaction of someone overwhelmed by financial stress and personal loss. Moreover, the defense made a compelling case regarding the lack of forensic evidence. No DNA or physical evidence linked Darren directly to the scene of the crime. While Darren's presence in Alabama during the time of the murder was suspicious, the defense pointed out that there was no clear evidence proving he had actually committed the murder. Darren's lawyer painted him as a man with a troubled past, but far from a calculated killer. Yet the most significant argument from the defense was the challenge to the prosecution's timeline. The defense insisted that the authorities had made numerous procedural errors, including arresting Jason and Darren based on circumstantial evidence. They also highlighted that the motorcycle, which played a key role in the prosecution's case, was never found with any physical traces that connected it to the murder. Without more solid proof, the defense claimed, the entire case rested on conjecture. As the trial unfolded, the jury was left to grapple with these conflicting narratives. On one hand, there was the undeniable circumstantial evidence, Jason's financial despair, the cryptic messages between the brothers, and Darren's suspicious behavior leading up to the murder. On the other hand, the defense raised legitimate concerns about the lack of direct evidence, questioning whether the prosecution's case was built more on suspicion than facts. But there was one very interesting fact. During Darren's 10-day stay in Alabama, no recordings of telephone conversations between him and his brother Jason were found. This led investigators to believe that the two may have resorted to more discreet methods of communication, possibly face-to-face meetings or the use of disposable phones, which are often linked to illegal activities because of their untraceable nature. The defense lawyer pointed out that despite these suspicions, no solid forensic evidence was found at the crime scene to implicate the brothers. There were no footprints, fingerprints, DNA, or even tire tracks from the motorcycle. The absence of these crucial elements, according to the defense, was a strong argument that the prosecution's case lacked concrete proof. The lawyer also questioned the reliability of the surveillance footage. The video, captured by a camera on a barn near Sarah's house, was grainy and of poor quality. While it did show a motorcycle passing by a few minutes after the crime, it did not provide a clear enough image to conclusively identify the rider or the bike. The defense suggested that this footage could easily show someone else, pointing out that many people in the area owned motorcycles and frequently rode past that barn. Thus, the footage was far from definitive evidence. One of the defense's key arguments came from an alibi Jason provided. On the morning of Sarah's murder, Jason was seen having breakfast with his children at a restaurant about 10 miles from Sarah's home. This was around the time the crime occurred, which the defense argued made it highly unlikely that Jason could have been directly involved in the murder. Moreover, Jason had cooperated with the police from the outset, handing over his mobile phone and computer voluntarily. The lawyer stressed that a guilty person, especially one involved in planning a murder, would have been far more guarded and less willing to let the police examine such personal items. However, the prosecution countered these arguments by focusing on Jason's behavior following his arrest. And suddenly, unexpectedly for everyone, he finally confessed to organizing the murder of his ex-wife. This confession, though, had complicated the defense's narrative. It was difficult for the jury to reconcile the image of a cooperative man with that of someone who later admitted to planning a brutal killing. After 6 days of heated court debates, the jury was tasked with deliberating the verdict. Their deliberations lasted 6 hours, and ultimately, on January 4, 2024, both brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Jason, who had been under house arrest and required to wear an electronic bracelet, was taken into custody immediately after the sentencing. The morning of July 20th, 2019, started like any other in Oxford, Mississippi. Law enforcement officers were on their routine patrols, keeping an eye on the quiet town. But at exactly 10:23 a.m., a deputy noticed something out of place near an old, weathered wooden picnic table. As he moved closer, his stomach sank. Lying motionless on the ground was the body of a young woman. Any hope that she might still be alive vanished within seconds. She had been shot multiple times. There were no signs of life. The deputy immediately called for backup, and within the hour, the crime scene was flooded with investigators, forensic specialists, and law enforcement officials. They worked quickly to gather evidence, knowing that every second counted in a case like this. The victim was identified almost immediately: 21-year-old Alexandra Costial, a student at the University of Mississippi. Later, the medical examiner confirmed the chilling details. Allie had been shot 9 times at close range. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Let's start from the very beginning and take a closer look at this true crime involving Alexandra Madison Costial, whom her loved ones affectionately called Ally. She was born on September 11, 1997, to Cindy and Keith Costial. From the moment she entered the world, she radiated an infectious warmth and a boundless enthusiasm for life. Growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, alongside her younger brother Andrew, Allie quickly became the heart of her family and social circles. She was the kind of person whose presence alone could brighten even the darkest days. Allie had an undeniable magnetism that drew people toward her. Even as a child, Allie possessed a unique ability to connect with others. She treated strangers with the same kindness and warmth as she did her closest friends and family members. Her generosity of spirit was not just an act of politeness, it was an integral part of who she was. She had a way of making people feel seen, valued, and loved, which was why so many gravitated toward her. Her optimism was unwavering, and her ability to find beauty in even the smallest moments made her truly special. Beyond her glowing personality, Allie was a dedicated and accomplished young woman. Throughout high school, from 2012 to 2016, she excelled both academically and athletically. She was a standout member of the track and field team, the golf team, and the field team. Her leadership skills shone through in her involvement with the Youth Government Support Group and the National Honor Society. But Allie's talents extended beyond the classroom and sports field. She had an insatiable thirst for new experiences and took on numerous extracurricular activities with enthusiasm. She practiced yoga regularly, finding solace in the serenity it brought her, and participated in half marathons whenever she had a break from her studies. Her passion for helping others was equally evident. Allie spent several summers traveling abroad as a volunteer, dedicating her time to teaching young children in Peru and Africa how to speak English. She found immense joy in uplifting those around her, firmly believing in the principle, "Don't be afraid to be who you are." This mantra guided her actions and inspired those who knew her. She embraced people wholeheartedly, never judging them for their quirks or flaws. Her unwavering loyalty made her a treasured friend, and her ability to be unapologetically herself was a quality admired by many. Allie's ambition didn't stop at high school. After graduating, she pursued her lifelong dream of attending the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss, in Oxford. She had envisioned herself there since childhood, and in the fall of 2016, that dream became a reality. There were many reasons why Ole Miss had always been her ideal school. She was drawn to its preppy, classic fashion style, which reflected the refined elegance she adored. The young woman had an affinity for all things pink and was rarely seen without her signature pearl accessories. She had a deep appreciation for beauty, whether in fashion, nature, or life itself. Sunsets were among her greatest passions. She loved the way the sky was painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. In fact, she was so enamored with sunsets that she created a social media page solely dedicated to capturing and sharing them with the world. Of course, there were more profound reasons for her love of Ole Miss. She admired the university's deep-rooted traditions, the distinguished professors who inspired her, and the lively atmosphere that made college life exhilarating. She was especially excited about the presence of a major football team, as she had always enjoyed the camaraderie that sports fostered. Enrolling in Ole Miss wasn't just about obtaining a degree in business and marketing. It was about embracing new opportunities, making lifelong memories, and, most importantly, finding happiness. Allie wasted no time immersing herself in campus life. She became a proud member of the Alpha Kappa Psi Women's Club, joined the business community, and even founded a golf club. Her passion for fitness remained strong, and in her free time, she taught yoga and Pilates classes, helping fellow students find balance in their busy lives. Despite her packed schedule, Allie never allowed her studies to suffer. She was meticulous in her time management, ensuring that every aspect of her life was given the attention it deserved. Yet despite all her achievements, there was one thing Allie felt was missing: love. Like many young college students, she dreamed of meeting someone special, someone who would become her partner for life. She had always been enchanted by the charm of Southern boys and the warmth of Southern culture, and she hoped that her time at Ole Miss would lead her to a meaningful relationship. She envisioned a future filled with love, marriage, a happy family, and children of her own. In high school, Allie had experienced infatuations, but none had developed into anything serious. She attended prom without a boyfriend, instead choosing to go with a close girlfriend. Love had eluded her then, but she remained hopeful that college would be different. And finally, her wish came true. Allie met Brandon Theld, a fellow freshman from Fort Worth, Texas. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable spark between them. Allie fell for him instantly, and as their freshman year progressed, they became inseparable. She invited him to almost every party, eager to share every moment of her new life with him. Although many people assumed that Allie and Brandon were in a committed relationship, the truth was far more complicated. Their connection, if it could even be called that, was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. They never officially declared themselves as boyfriend and girlfriend, never made long-term plans together, and never envisioned a shared future. At times, Brandon would abruptly cut off all communication, blocking Allie's number for weeks or even months. She was drawn to Brandon from the very beginning. She imagined their relationship growing into something profound, a love story that would culminate in marriage and a future together. But Brandon was not the kind of person who valued deep emotional attachments. He was a self-serving manipulator, someone who knew exactly how to string Allie along without ever offering her true commitment. To him, she was just one of many. He had mastered the art of making each woman in his life believe they were special while never investing in any of them beyond temporary gratification. He thrived on the illusion of romance, keeping his options open and his emotions guarded. If Allie ever pressed him for clarity, he deflected, claiming that he was not good enough for her, that she deserved someone better, using false humility as a weapon to keep her tethered to his whims. Their relationship was an emotional whirlwind, an endless cycle of highs and lows. One moment, Allie was euphoric, feeling cherished and adored, and the next, she was consumed by despair, questioning her worth and fighting back tears. Unlike true partners, Brandon never made an effort to integrate himself into her life. He never visited her home, never made an effort to know her friends, and remained a shadowy figure in her world. Most of Allie's close friends barely knew of his existence beyond what she told them, and even then, she revealed very little. She internalized the turmoil, confiding in no one, perhaps even convincing herself that things were not as bad as they seemed. She was isolated, trapped in a one-sided love affair fueled by her own hope and his calculated indifference. In the past, Allie had always been open with her mother, Cindy, sharing the details of her life and her emotions with unfiltered honesty. Cindy knew her daughter had feelings for a boy from her course, but Allie never fully disclosed the true nature of her relationship with Brandon. Perhaps she feared judgment, or maybe she herself hadn't come to terms with how unhealthy it had become. She wasn't naive. She was simply a 19-year-old woman, far from home, intoxicated by the thrill of attention from someone she cared about. But no matter how much she wished for it, the reality was that she was trapped in a toxic cycle of emotional manipulation. Fast forward to the summer of 2019, a significant time in Allie's life as she approached her final year of college. She had recently turned 21 and had chosen to remain on campus for the summer. She spent those months attending summer courses, engaging in extracurricular activities, and enjoying the company of her friends. Despite the occasional emotional turmoil caused by Brandon, Allie tried to focus on her goals and personal growth. In early July, Allie's parents visited her, a trip that brought her immense joy. They spent quality time together setting up her new off-campus apartment, shopping for essentials, cooking meals, and simply enjoying one another's presence. Allie had missed them dearly and wished they could stay longer. She even begged them to extend their visit by just one more day, but obligations back in St. Louis forced them to leave. Cindy later recalled feeling an unusual heaviness in her heart as they said goodbye, an inexplicable sorrow she couldn't quite place at the time. Still, they kept in touch regularly. Allie frequently called home, updating her parents on her life, her studies, and her daily activities. On July 19, 2019, Allie made one of those routine calls. It was around 7 p.m., and she had just woken up from a long nap. The night before, she had stayed up late studying for an important test, exhausting herself in the process. She chatted with her mother, filling her in on the day's plans. Later that evening, she intended to go out with friends to a bar. It was an ordinary conversation, nothing out of the ordinary, no signs, no warnings, nothing to suggest that in just a few hours, tragedy would strike. Later that night, at exactly 11:52 p.m., surveillance cameras positioned outside a business on Oxford Square captured Allie leaving the bar alone. The footage showed her staring at her phone screen, walking in the opposite direction of the establishment. Later that night, a taxi arrived to pick up Allie. The driver confirmed that she remained polite throughout the short ride back to her apartment. By the time the vehicle pulled up to her residence, it was just past midnight. The driver watched as Allie stepped out, walked toward her building, and disappeared inside. The morning of July 20th, 2019, began as any other, with law enforcement patrolling various areas around Oxford. That day, a Lafayette County deputy sheriff was conducting a routine patrol in Harmon Town near Lake Sardis, a remote area approximately 30 miles north of the Ole Miss campus. The officer didn't expect to find anything unusual, but as he neared an abandoned fishing spot along the shore, his routine drive turned into the start of a harrowing investigation. At precisely 10:23 a.m., the deputy spotted something unusual near a weathered wooden picnic table. As he approached, his worst fears were confirmed. The lifeless body of a young woman lay sprawled across the ground. It was immediately apparent that she had been shot multiple times. No signs of life remained. The officer quickly called for backup, and within the hour, the crime scene was swarming with investigators. The victim was identified almost immediately. It was 21-year-old Ole Miss student Alexandra Costial. The medical examiner later determined that Allie had been shot a total of 9 times at close range. The pattern of shell casings surrounding the scene suggested that the shooter had moved in a circular motion, firing at Allie from multiple angles as she sat on the picnic bench, unable to escape. Investigators located 11 spent shell casings littering the dirt around her, as well as her purse, which had been tossed into a ditch several feet away. Inside the bag, detectives discovered her student ID and driver's license, both of which confirmed her identity. As officers pieced together the crime scene, they noted one peculiar absence. Allie's mobile phone was missing. This small but crucial detail hinted that the killer had taken the device, either to prevent her from calling for help or to erase evidence. Attempts to track the phone's GPS yielded only a vague location ping somewhere in Oxford, providing little useful information. However, Allie's smartwatch, which she often wore, proved to be an unexpected lifeline in the investigation. Allie's smartwatch was synced to her missing phone, allowing investigators to retrieve duplicated text messages from the night of her murder. The records revealed a conversation between Allie and one specific individual, her classmate, 22-year-old Brandon Theld. It wasn't just idle chit-chat. The texts showed that Allie and Brandon had arranged to meet shortly after she left the bar that night, choosing to part ways with her friends for reasons unknown. Allie's friends were quick to confirm Brandon's name when questioned. When asked if anyone might have had a reason to harm Allie, his name surfaced immediately. One of Brandon's own roommates described him as a deeply misogynistic, arrogant individual who frequently made crude, derogatory comments about women. He had a history of manipulating those around him, making false promises, and discarding people once he no longer had use for them. To those who knew him well, it came as little surprise that he might be involved in something sinister. With suspicion mounting, investigators reached out to Brandon, requesting that he come in for questioning. He agreed but failed to appear at the scheduled time. When officers called him again, he provided a flimsy excuse, claiming he had been drinking the night before and wasn't in a state to speak with law enforcement. A second meeting was arranged for the following morning. Again, Brandon agreed, but once more, he failed to show. This time, however, his absence was no accident. Brandon Theld was officially on the run. With Brandon now a fugitive, authorities acted swiftly. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and his name was entered into the national database. Investigators tracked his movements through his mobile phone records and credit card transactions, which painted a clear picture of his escape route. The data indicated that he was heading toward Memphis, Tennessee. A statewide bulletin was sent out, alerting authorities to be on the lookout for his vehicle, a dark-colored pickup truck. Within hours, the Memphis Police Department's fugitive task force spotted a vehicle matching the description at a gas station just outside the city. Officers surrounded the suspect, took him into custody without incident, and discovered damning evidence inside the truck. In the passenger seat of Brandon's vehicle sat a .40 caliber pistol. Forensic analysis later confirmed that this was the same weapon used to kill Allie. Even more incriminating was the presence of bloodstains on Brandon's shirt. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Brandon vehemently denied any involvement in Allie's death. He maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no reason to harm her. But law enforcement wasn't convinced. Within hours of his capture, Brandon Theld was charged with first-degree murder. Following his arrest, Brandon was extradited back to Mississippi, where he was held without bail. He refused to speak with detectives, invoking his right to remain silent until legal counsel was present. Investigators, determined to build a rock-solid case, began piecing together his actions leading up to the murder. They discovered that on the weekend of Allie's death, Brandon had spent time with his usual group of friends. Witnesses confirmed that he had gone bowling with them. However, Sunday took a different turn. That evening, Brandon showed up at a friend's house, carrying a pistol. There was nothing unusual about this either. Brandon arrived at his friend's house carrying a six-pack of beer, a familiar habit for their weekend gatherings. They spent the evening drinking, sharing stories, and engaging in casual target practice, setting up empty cans along the fence line and taking turns shooting at them. Brandon seemed relaxed, unbothered, his demeanor giving no indication of the events that had taken place just hours earlier. But when his friend woke up the next morning, Brandon was already gone. His truck missing from the driveway, his presence vanished without a trace. Brandon Theld was born into a well-respected Christian family in Texas, where he was raised with love and discipline. His parents, both successful doctors, ensured he had a comfortable upbringing. His father owned a private clinic, and his mother worked at a hospital, setting high expectations for their son. Brandon grew up enjoying the great outdoors, hunting and fishing, pastimes that many young men from his town partook in. In high school, he played football, excelling in sports but never showing any signs of aggression or violence. There were no known incidents of fights, outbursts, or behavioral problems. To those who knew him then, Brandon was just another all-American boy with a bright future ahead of him. But something changed when he entered the University of Mississippi. That was where he met Allie Costial at a bar one night. Their attraction was evident, but even from the beginning, it was clear that Allie liked Brandon much more than he liked her. As time went on, Allie's attachment deepened, and she sent him more and more messages. Eventually, the sheer volume of texts overwhelmed Brandon to the point that he blocked her number. But as patterns often repeat, something changed once again, and before long, the two resumed communication. Meanwhile, the investigation into Allie's murder continued, and as details unfolded, the community was shaken to its core. On July 27, 2019, more than 100 people gathered in Oxford for a candlelight vigil in honor of Alexandra Costial. Friends, classmates, and professors mourned the loss of a young woman described as a bright light in their lives, someone who had left an unforgettable mark on everyone she met. One question haunted them all. Who could possibly have wanted to harm Allie? The answer, though devastating, was undeniable. Brandon Theld. On July 23rd, Brandon made his first court appearance, officially charged with the murder of Allie Costial. But as investigators delved deeper into their relationship, they uncovered a shocking revelation that shifted the narrative of the case. The motive, it seemed, was far more heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. In April 2019, just 3 months before her murder, Allie had been preparing for her spring semester final exams. However, unbeknownst to her friends and family, she was also focused on another kind of test, a pregnancy test. On April 12th, Allie sent Brandon a message explaining that feared she might be pregnant. His response was immediate. He instructed her not to tell anyone, not their friends, not her family. He needed time to process what she was saying. 2 days later, Allie sent Brandon a photo of the test. It was unclear, neither fully positive nor definitively negative. A faint second line appeared, leaving room for uncertainty. With the picture, Allie also sent a simple yet significant request. Could they meet in person to talk? Brandon did not respond. Days passed, and Allie sent more messages, growing anxious with each unanswered text. Finally, when Brandon did reply, his response was neither supportive nor kind. His message was brutally clear. He had no interest in discussing it further. If she was pregnant, he wanted her to fix the situation immediately. He urged her to take a pill and put an end to it. He insisted that he did not want a child, claiming that fatherhood would ruin his future. He was unyielding, refusing to offer Allie even the slightest reassurance. If she chose to keep the baby, she would be on her own. He would not help, he would not acknowledge the child, and he would not allow this situation to dictate his life. His words were cold, devoid of emotion, as he repeated over and over that she was making a mistake by keeping the baby. From April through July, Allie continued reaching out, desperately hoping for a conversation, a resolution, some level of understanding. But Brandon avoided her at all costs. He ignored her texts for days at a time, only to reply with short, dismissive responses that made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her or the pregnancy. Several times, Allie asked to meet in person, but Brandon repeatedly canceled at the last minute. Still, she refused to give up. At one particularly dark moment, Allie made a disturbing admission. She had attempted to drink herself into oblivion, hoping that alcohol poisoning would bring an end to her suffering. She listed the staggering amounts she had consumed in a single night: an entire bottle of tequila, 2 bottles of champagne, 7 cans of beer, and a glass of wine. While it was clear to any rational observer that these claims were likely exaggerated, the underlying message was undeniable. This was a desperate cry for help. Many people who knew him regarded him as a spoiled daddy's boy. someone who flaunted his father's wealth as a shield against consequences. He often bragged that his father's money could get him out of any trouble, that no matter what he did, he would never have to face real consequences. But this time, he was wrong. The evidence against Brandon was overwhelming. Beyond the bullet casings that matched his pistol, the bloodstains on his shirt, and the text messages proving he had met Allie that fateful night, there was another damning piece of evidence. One that revealed his state of mind in the aftermath of the crime. When police searched Brandon's apartment, they uncovered a handwritten letter addressed to his parents. While it stopped short of being an outright confession, its contents spoke volumes. In the letter, Brandon expressed guilt and remorse, acknowledging that he was a bad person but insisting that it wasn't his parents' fault. He described being tormented by dark thoughts, which were exacerbated by alcohol, and admitted that he saw no way out. He wrote that he would either go to prison or die, seemingly resigned to his fate. The letter painted a picture of a man who knew he would be caught, a man who had already accepted that his actions would lead to ruin. Brandon's lawyer later claimed that this was nothing more than a suicide note, evidence that Brandon had intended to harm himself. The letter, along with the mountain of other evidence, pointed to one undeniable fact. Allie's murder was premeditated. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more disturbing details that further solidified their case. 1 week before Allie's death, on Friday, July 12th, Brandon made an unexpected trip from Oxford to Fort Worth, returning to his parents' house under the guise of a casual visit. But the real reason for his trip soon became clear. While at home, he retrieved his pistol, a weapon he had left behind when he moved to college, and brought it back with him to Mississippi. He even took a photograph of the gun and posted it on social media with the caption, "Finally bringing my baby back to Oxford." As detectives continued to piece together the puzzle, they made another chilling discovery. Brandon's internet search history in the days leading up to the murder. Among his searches were phrases like, "how to get away with committing a crime," "how to plan a murder," "how to tie people up," and "how to lure them into a trap." He also looked up tactical face masks and gun silencers. It was clear that Brandon had spent considerable time crafting his plan, ensuring that when the time came, he would be ready. Brandon's defense attorney attempted to argue that internet searches alone did not prove premeditated murder. He claimed that Brandon had simply been curious, that people searched for all sorts of things online without acting on them. He also insisted that Brandon bringing his gun back to Mississippi was not suspicious. After all, Oxford had shooting ranges where students regularly practiced, but the prosecution wasn't buying it. On July 17, 2019, Brandon finally broke his months-long silence and reached out to Allie. For the first time since April, he pretended he wanted to talk about the pregnancy. He dangled the possibility of reconciliation, leading Allie to believe that he was ready to discuss their future. She was ecstatic, unaware that she was walking into a trap. Then on the night of July 18, at precisely 1:53 a.m., Allie sent Brandon a message with a photo of her belly. Though it was barely visible, she was convinced that she was beginning to show. For Brandon, this was the tipping point. The sight of that message ignited a terror in him, one that could only be extinguished by silencing Allie permanently. That very day, Brandon reached out to Allie once again. He casually asked whether her friends would be around when he visited. The young woman, hopeful and naive, believed that Brandon's insistence on secrecy stemmed from the delicate nature of the conversation they were about to have. She interpreted his request as a sign that he was finally taking responsibility and wanted to address the situation in private. Feeling an enormous sense of relief, mixed with nervous anticipation, Allie readily agreed to meet him without witnesses. She reassured herself that he was finally willing to listen and work through the situation together. In reality, however, Brandon had no intention of offering support. His only goal was to ensure that she would be alone, away from prying eyes, and that no one would be able to track her whereabouts once she left with him. By the time July 19 arrived, Brandon was still meticulously setting his plan into motion. He confirmed their meeting time once more, solidifying the arrangement. The two agreed to meet after Allie returned from the bar, with Allie promising to leave early so nothing would interfere with their long overdue discussion. Surveillance footage later captured Brandon's truck, its distinctive license plate clearly visible, heading toward Allie's residence at exactly 1:14 a.m. The same camera later recorded the vehicle moving in the opposite direction, confirming that he had taken her somewhere. GPS data corroborated this, showing that Allie's and Brandon's mobile phones were in close proximity as they traveled through Oxford, their destination, Lake Sardis. Brandon had been drinking heavily throughout the day, drowning himself in alcohol long before picking Allie up. Once they reached the secluded location, he continued consuming alcohol, his intoxication making him more volatile and unpredictable. Seated at an old picnic table by the water, they began talking. Allie, eager and nervous, tried to get him to understand her feelings, to make him see that this was about more than just him. But as the conversation progressed, Brandon's temper flared. Enraged by the situation, frustrated by the reality he refused to accept, he stormed off to his truck. Allie had no idea what was about to happen. Moments later, Brandon returned, now holding a pistol in his hand. Without hesitation, he raised the weapon and opened fire. Allie never stood a chance. She was shot at least 9 times, the force of the bullets knocking her backward, her body collapsing onto the table. One bullet even lodged into the wood, marking the place where she had spent her final moments. Witnesses later recalled hearing multiple shots in the vicinity between 2 and 2:30 a.m. But by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. At exactly 10 a.m., according to GPS data, both mobile phones began moving back toward Oxford. Brandon, now having committed the crime, didn't waste time dwelling on what he had done. Less than an hour after returning to town, he searched the internet for information on how to monitor police radio channels. Soon after, he scoured the web for news related to Lake Sardis, Mississippi, likely wanting to see if Allie's body had been discovered. Over the next several hours, his phone continued pinging from the same cellular towers as Allie's, until hers abruptly lost signal. Investigators later concluded that Brandon had powered down her phone before disposing of it. Then, as if nothing had happened, he casually went to meet up with his friends, drank beer, and even flaunted his pistol. On August 22nd, Brandon appeared in court for a bail hearing. However, instead of proceeding as planned, his lawyer made a strategic decision. He withdrew the request for bail and instead petitioned the judge to order a psychological evaluation for his client. It was a calculated move, an attempt to delay the case and potentially reduce Brandon's sentence by portraying him as mentally unstable. The judge approved both motions, ensuring that Brandon would remain behind bars without bail while undergoing a psychiatric assessment. A week later, on August 30, 2019, Brandon returned to court, where he was formally charged with the kidnapping and murder of Alexandra Costial. In Mississippi, such crimes carried the possibility of the death penalty. The psychological evaluation found that Brandon was fully sane and competent to stand trial, meaning he would not be able to use mental instability as an excuse for his horrific actions. Despite the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, Brandon pleaded not guilty. His defense team continued to argue that there was no solid proof that he had planned the crime in advance, hoping to poke holes in the prosecution's case. But the digital evidence, GPS data, forensic findings, and his own internet searches told a different story. By the time 2020 arrived, the legal process was still ongoing. The pandemic caused significant delays in the judicial system, pushing back Brandon's trial. By the time the long-awaited trial finally commenced, Brandon Theld made a shocking decision, one that caught many by surprise. After months of insisting on his innocence, after delays, hearings, and legal maneuvering, he suddenly reversed course. On August 27, 2021, Brandon accepted a plea deal, admitting his guilt in the murder of Alexandra Costial in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was a move that spared him the possibility of receiving the death penalty, a strategic choice made by both the defense and the prosecution. State authorities, recognizing the challenges of securing a death sentence given the legal hurdles and evidentiary requirements, agreed to the deal. In doing so, They ensured that the Brandon Theld would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, never to walk free again. She was last seen alive, just a few hours after putting her children to bed, slipping into what should have been another peaceful night. When a wife mysteriously disappeared without a trace, the idyllic facade of family life quickly crumbled, revealing a darker reality. Just hours before her disappearance, there were strange phone calls and unexpected events that suggested something sinister was brewing. A secret phone, mysterious late-night activity, and conflicting accounts of that fateful night slowly bubbled to the surface. The investigation was complicated further by a lack of physical evidence, making it a challenging puzzle for authorities. What really happened on that fateful night? On the morning of October 30, 2011, Karen Swift's two young daughters, Ashley, age 9, and Key, age 6, awoke to find their mother missing from their home. The previous evening, Ashley had called her mother from a friend's house, where she was attending a Halloween sleepover party. Feeling ill and no longer wanting to stay, she asked her mother to pick her up. Karen, who had been at a Halloween gathering herself, drove over to collect Ashley, despite not initially planning to return home that night. By around 2 a.m., the mother and daughter had settled into bed together, ending what seemed to be a relatively uneventful evening. But when the girls woke up the next morning, Karen was gone. Ashley, who had fallen asleep beside her mother, was now with her younger sister Key in a different room. The girls had been moved during the night without waking, leaving a strange and unsettling gap in their memories. Even more troubling, Karen's white 2004 Nissan Murano was also missing. As the hours ticked by and no word came from Karen, concern began to mount. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, 2 separate calls were made to the Dyer County Sheriff's Office to report her missing. One call came from her husband, David Swift, who had been trying to locate her after phoning some of her friends with no luck. The second call was placed by 2 of those friends, Bill and Kathy Bona, after spotting Karen's car abandoned along Millsfield Highway, less than half a mile from the family's home. When deputies arrived on the scene, they found David Swift already there with the car. He had unlocked it and briefly searched inside, but found no sign of Karen's belongings. Her cell phone, purse, and keys were missing, and there were no immediate signs of struggle. A single rusty screw was found embedded in one of the tires, suggesting that Karen had run over the object, causing the flat. Neither Deputy Alexandra nor Sergeant Walker, who soon arrived to assist, found anything obviously amiss within the vehicle. No blood, no broken glass, no indication that a violent act had occurred. A forensic examination by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, later confirmed the absence of any critical physical evidence inside the SUV. Deputy Sheriff Alexander noticed one unusual detail, however. As he prepared to move the car, he discovered that the driver's seat had been adjusted to a height that was comfortable for him. This was odd, considering that Karen Swift would likely have had to move the seat much closer to the steering wheel. This subtle clue immediately raised questions about whether Karen had been the last driver of the car. The search for Karen Swift commenced quickly, expanding out from the site where her car was discovered. In the vicinity of the vehicle, a pair of jeans and a shirt, later confirmed to belong to Karen, were found discarded. Inside the car, her Halloween costume from the party the previous night lay undisturbed. Her abandoned car was located mere minutes from the Swift home, yet there were no reports of anyone having seen her in the intervening hours after she returned with Ashley. Karen's husband, David, informed the police that he had last seen his wife around 2 a.m. when she came home with Ashley. He offered no other details about the night, except that Karen had filed for divorce just 3 weeks earlier. Despite the separation, the couple had continued to live together under the same roof to maintain a sense of normalcy for their 4 children, which included their 2 older sons, Preston and Dustin, from a previous period in their marriage. The Swifts had a complicated relationship. First married in 1989, Karen and David seemed like the quintessential small-town couple, eventually welcoming 2 boys into their family. In 1996, the relationship took a dramatic turn when David began an affair with a co-worker, a liaison that lasted 3 years and resulted in the birth of a child. Karen discovered her husband's infidelity when the child was born, and in 2000, she filed for divorce. The dissolution of their marriage seemed inevitable. But just as the ink dried on their divorce papers, a strange thing happened. The two began to reconcile, and later that same year, they remarried on the anniversary of their original wedding day. This turbulent history added complexity to the investigation, as detectives tried to piece together whether Karen's recent filing for divorce had reignited old tensions or if other darker forces were at play. Though David remained cooperative in the investigation, his past indiscretions and the timing of Karen's disappearance created an air of suspicion around him. Still, no hard evidence ever emerged to definitively tie him to his wife's fate. The second time around, after their reconciliation and remarriage, Karen and David Swift welcomed 2 more children, both girls, Ashley and Key. This seemed to mark a new chapter for the couple, but soon it would be Karen who stepped outside the boundaries of the marriage. She began an affair, flipping the narrative of their tumultuous relationship. In response to Karen's infidelity, David, taking control of the situation, decided that the family needed a fresh start. At that time, the family was living in Arkansas. David quit his job, quickly found another in manufacturing management in Dyersburg, Tennessee, and, without consulting Karen, purchased a new house. The decision to uproot the family was made swiftly and so abruptly that their eldest son, Preston, was left behind to finish out the school year, while the rest of the family packed up and moved to their new home in Tennessee. The house was completely unfamiliar to Karen, who saw it for the first time when she was unloading boxes into it. Despite the sudden and unexpected relocation, Karen adapted to her new environment faster than one might have expected. Allegedly, David preferred that she not work, but the independent and outgoing Karen found ways to earn her own money. She began cleaning houses and doing landscaping work. Her passion for fitness also led her to start teaching aerobics classes, where she quickly became a fixture in her community. Karen's outgoing and cheerful nature helped her make new friends in Dyersburg. Those who knew her described her as a truly selfless person, someone who always put the needs and comfort of others ahead of her own, sometimes to her own detriment. However, despite her apparent strength and resilience, Karen's marriage was once again on rocky ground. The couple's reconciliation hadn't erased their past troubles, and soon it became clear that their relationship was heading for another divorce. Karen, though outwardly maintaining her upbeat demeanor, had become fearful of David's behavior. She confided in some friends about her concerns, mentioning that David had begun stalking her when she went out and would confront her when she spent time with her girlfriends. Nonetheless, Karen downplayed the severity of the situation. She often reassured her friends that there was no reason to be overly concerned. David's behavior was unpredictable, yes, but she told herself and others that she was probably exaggerating the danger in her mind. David's behavior during the investigation added to the growing unease surrounding Karen's disappearance. Following his phone call to report her missing, David met with police for questioning. He arrived with a set of crutches, explaining that a knee injury he had sustained earlier in the year had flared up again in the days leading up to Karen's disappearance. This injury would become a significant point of discussion later, raising questions about David's ability, or inability, to have been involved in Karen's disappearance in a more physical way. During his interview, David made a surprising revelation. He informed detectives that Karen had been using a second secret cell phone. He claimed that this phone had been given to her by Bill Bona, the husband of her friend Kathy. David didn't know the number of this phone, but suggested that its existence was evidence of Karen's secretive behavior. From there, David's account took on a darker tone. He implied that Karen's recent social life, particularly her association with the Bonas, had led her down a troubling path. He described her as a heavy drinker and a partier, seemingly intent on tarnishing her reputation. According to David, Karen's behavior had changed dramatically after their move to Dyersburg, and he blamed her new friends for this transformation. David told story after story about what he perceived as Karen's erratic and inappropriate behavior. One particularly bizarre tale involved him walking in on Karen naked in their hot tub. Another incident he recounted to detectives involved him finding Karen naked in bed with Kathy Bona. While these stories seemed intended to paint Karen in a negative light, the detectives grew increasingly frustrated with David's narrative, which seemed more focused on disparaging his wife than on helping them understand her disappearance. As the interview continued, the detectives attempted to refocus David's attention on the key question: where could Karen have gone if she had left the house after he went to bed? David, rather than offering any concrete ideas, once again pointed the finger at Kathy Bona, claiming that Kathy had informed him that Karen's phone had pinged by the Mississippi River. According to David, this information had supposedly come from the police themselves, but there was no confirmation of this claim. His suggestion that Kathy had some inside knowledge of Karen's whereabouts only deepened the detective's suspicions about his evasive answers. When David finally left the police station, crutches in hand, he agreed to allow investigators into his home for a walkthrough. The search of the Swift home revealed nothing of immediate significance. There were no signs of foul play, no bloodstains, no broken furniture or anything to indicate a violent struggle had taken place. The house itself was somewhat untidy, particularly in the downstairs bedroom where Karen slept, but nothing was out of the ordinary for a household with young children. Like the forensic examination of Karen's car, the search of the home failed to provide any solid clues as to what had happened to Karen that night. While the walkthrough didn't yield any new evidence, the growing tension surrounding David's stories and the lack of concrete answers left detectives with more questions than answers. As the investigation progressed, David's attempts to control the narrative around Karen's life and disappearance would come under greater scrutiny. His quick judgment of Karen's new social circle and his focus on her behavior painted a stark contrast to the woman her friends described, someone who had always been caring, responsible, and devoted to her children, even amidst personal turmoil. While David's perspective offered one version of events, it left many wondering whether there was more to the story than what he was willing to share. Outside of the Swift family home, investigator Terry McCree made a discovery that would later raise suspicions: 7 gallons of bleach. David Swift provided an explanation, saying that the bleach was necessary because of an incident involving his dogs. A neighbor of the Swifts, John Hogsshooter, had been arrested on the same day as Karen's disappearance on charges of animal cruelty. He was accused of poisoning the Swifts' dogs along with other neighborhood pets. Hogsshooter later claimed that the poisoning had been accidental, asserting that he didn't even know what the Swifts' dogs looked like. According to Hogsshooter, he had placed fly killer around his property to deal with the flies that had gathered around construction materials in his yard. David had used the bleach to clean up the vomit left by the poisoned dogs. Though this seemed to satisfy investigators initially, the bleach was not taken into evidence, but Hogsshooter's involvement in Karen's disappearance became a point of interest. While McCree searched the property, he also discovered divorce papers tucked under a tire in the back of David's vehicle. The papers that Karen handed David indicated that their marriage was in the process of being divorced. As the days turned into weeks and there were no signs of Karen, detectives grew increasingly frustrated. They asked David Swift to return to the station for another round of questioning. By this time, David had provided multiple versions of the events surrounding the last time he saw his wife. His stories varied in minor but significant ways. Initially, he claimed he hadn't actually seen Karen, only spoken to her from the top of the stairs. Later, he said that he had indeed seen her, though he couldn't remember what she was wearing. In his most recent account, he offered more detail, saying he saw her clearly and could describe her clothing. The inconsistencies were subtle but concerning, and they only deepened the investigator's suspicion. As the interview came to an end, David inquired about the state of the investigation. He was told that the search for Karen was still ongoing, though progress was slow. The case continued to drag on for months with few new leads. However, a breakthrough came when Trooper Jason Page made a significant discovery. 2 cell phones were found in a wooded area 145 feet off Hardness Road, approximately 500 feet from the Swift family home. Both phones, Karen's regular Verizon phone and the second secret phone, known as the Voyager, were recovered in close proximity to each other, between the location of Karen's abandoned vehicle and her home. The cell phone data turned out to be crucial. Investigators learned that David had installed a signal extender in the family home, a device that boosted cellular signals in their rural area. This extender automatically connected any phone within its range, logging the time and date of each connection. Through this data, detectives were able to establish a timeline. Karen's Verizon phone connected to the extender just after 2 a.m. on October 30, confirming that she had returned home with her daughter Ashley after picking her up from the sleepover. The phone disconnected from the extender at 4:38 a.m., indicating it had left the house. By 5:09 a.m., the phone had gone off the network entirely and was never turned on again. When it was discovered, the phone had been partially crushed, perhaps run over or smashed against the ground. Witnesses first reported seeing Karen's vehicle pulled over on the roadside just minutes later, around 5:15 a.m. The second phone, the Voyager, presented even more puzzling clues. It also connected to the house's signal extender, but at 9:55 a.m., a full 5 hours after Karen's main phone had been turned off. At that time, a single call was made from the Voyager to check the phone's voicemail. Shortly afterward, this phone also ended up discarded in the same wooded area as Karen's primary phone. The fact that both phones were found together so close to the Swift house raised unsettling questions. The bonus, who had given Karen the Voyager phone, explained to investigators that they had done so to help her communicate privately with her divorce attorney. They said that David had been controlling and sought to monitor Karen's every move. They had also lent her money to hire the attorney and file for divorce. While the phones provided valuable information, the case remained unsolved for several more weeks. Then, on December 10, 2011, a critical discovery was made. John Robinson, a preacher at the Boga Church of Christ, along with his friend Mark Rickman, were leaving Waldow Cemetery when they noticed something unusual beneath a thick cover of kudzu vines. Upon closer inspection, they realized they had found human remains. The cemetery, less than 3 miles from the Swift home, was a remote and overgrown area, making it an ideal location to conceal a body. Investigators were quickly called to the scene, and an autopsy confirmed that the remains belonged to Karen Swift. The condition of the body indicated that Karen had likely been killed elsewhere and dragged to the spot where she was found. Her clothing was largely absent, with only her undergarments pushed below her knees, suggesting that they may have been pulled down while her body was dragged across the gravel pathway into the kudzu. Despite the condition of the body, the autopsy revealed no clear signs of sexual assault, and the exact cause of death was difficult to determine due to decomposition. However, it was clear that Karen's death had been the result of a violent attack. After weeks of searching, when Karen Swift's remains were finally discovered, the medical examiner was unable to definitively state her exact cause of death due to the state of decomposition. However, the examination revealed that Karen had sustained blunt force trauma to the head. The pathologist determined that the blow was delivered with a heavy, unknown object while Karen was against a hard surface. This injury would have been fatal if Karen were alive at the time it was inflicted, which strongly suggested that the attack had been intentional and violent. The case, which had been treated as a missing person investigation, was officially reclassified as a homicide, though the weapon used to kill Karen was never recovered. David Swift, Karen's husband, remained the primary suspect in the investigation. From the beginning, investigators found it suspicious that David never participated in the searches for his wife. His behavior was peculiar, yet despite their suspicions, detectives could not find any concrete evidence. The search of the family home, property, and vehicles did not yield any clues that pointed to where the fatal blow might have taken place. Furthermore, during interviews, David showed no signs of physical injury, no scratches, bruises, or any other indication that he had been in a struggle with Karen. Investigators also noted that Karen had no foreign DNA under her fingernails, which would have suggested a fight against an attacker. An additional complication for the investigation came from David's well-documented knee injury. Earlier that year, in April 2011, David had injured his left knee and undergone surgery to repair it. Just 3 days before Karen's disappearance, a co-worker witnessed David's knee give out in the hallway at work, causing him to collapse to the floor. For days before, and many following, Karen's death, David was reportedly reliant on crutches and unable to put the full weight of his body on his injured leg. This created a major puzzle for the investigators. If David was physically incapacitated, how could he have committed such a brutal murder? Nevertheless, despite the apparent physical limitations posed by his knee injury, David's inconsistencies and the tension surrounding their divorce kept him under scrutiny. Investigators delved into other aspects of David's life and the people connected to the Swifts. Among those whose actions were closely examined were Bill and Kathy Bona, close friends of Karen, and their neighbor John Hogshuter. Each of these individuals had been in Karen's orbit at the time of her death, and their behaviors seemed suspicious enough to merit deeper investigation. Kathy Bona's 40th birthday party, which Karen had attended shortly before her death, also became a focus of investigators. At the party, multiple guests, including Karen, were reported to have undressed and spent time in a hot tub together. David Swift mentioned this event several times during his interviews with police, implying that Karen might have been physically involved with others at the party. While there was no solid proof that these interactions had anything to do with Karen's murder, investigators considered the possibility that they could have contributed to David's growing anger and jealousy, providing a potential motive. Meanwhile, the peculiar behavior of their neighbor, John Hogshuter, added another layer of intrigue to the case. Hogshuter had been arrested for allegedly poisoning neighborhood pets, including the Swifts' dogs, though he claimed the poisoning was accidental. On the same day that Karen disappeared, she had confronted Hogshuter about the incident, which had left her visibly upset. After her death, other strange occurrences were reported in the neighborhood. One of the Swifts' sons, Dustin, recounted a disturbing encounter with a man near Waldow Cemetery not long before Karen's body was found there. The man was using a metal detector and claimed he was exercising in the cemetery. When questioned further, the man said he was searching for a lost watch. Odd, as Dustin had noticed the man was already wearing a watch. This strange encounter, though not directly linked to Karen's death, added to the cloud of mystery surrounding the case. As years passed without any arrest, speculation about Karen's murder only grew, both in the media and among the local community. The Swift family eventually left Dyersburg, and David remarried and relocated to Jefferson County, Alabama. However, public pressure on Tennessee authorities to charge someone for Karen's murder remained. Investigators, including Terry McCree, continued to review the case file, building a theory that kept pointing back to David Swift. They believed that, driven by anger over Karen's decision to file for divorce and feeling a loss of control, David began plotting his wife's murder in the days leading up to her death. One of the most troubling elements of this theory was the possibility that David had faked the severity of his knee injury to create an alibi. Investigators speculated that his collapse at work, witnessed by his coworker, might have been staged to give the impression that he was physically incapable of carrying out a murder. According to this theory, David's anger over Karen attending a Halloween party with Bill and Kathy Bona instead of having dinner with him further fueled his rage. It was believed that Karen was attacked while she slept, as there were no defensive wounds, and she may have been caught completely off guard. However, investigators found it difficult to determine exactly where the fatal blow had been delivered, as no signs of a violent struggle were found in the bedroom or elsewhere in the home. Adding to the complexity of the case, it was theorized that David may have moved their daughter Ashley, who had been sleeping in the same bed as Karen, to another room before attacking his wife. This would have ensured that the child would not be awakened by the violence. Though strangulation was suspected as a means of subduing Karen, the true nature of the attack remained unclear due to the lack of evidence. Karen Swift's body was dragged into the garage, investigators believed, where she received the fatal blow to her head. This injury, inflicted with a blunt object, was likely delivered as she lay against a hard surface. After incapacitating her, David Swift allegedly placed her either in his vehicle or hers, and then drove the 3 miles to Waldow Cemetery, where he discarded her body beneath a thick tangle of vines. This area, obscured by kudzu and undergrowth, was isolated enough that her remains would not be easily spotted, but still close enough to the Swift home to make the trip plausible within the timeline detectives were piecing together. In an effort to understand the sequence of events that followed, detectives reconstructed the route that David might have taken that night. They speculated that, after leaving Karen's body in the cemetery, he returned to the house to set the stage for her apparent disappearance. David, according to this theory, wanted it to look as if Karen had gone out alone, only to have car trouble in the early morning hours. To make this scenario seem believable, he punctured one of her tires using an old screw he found in the garage and let the air out, creating the illusion of a flat tire. Then, around 4:40 a.m., just minutes after Karen's phone disconnected from the home's signal extender, he drove her Nissan to a location not far from the house, but far enough that it would look like she had been stranded. On his way, David allegedly disposed of her primary phone, a Verizon device, by tossing it into the woods. However, Karen had a second secret cell phone, her Voyager, hidden in a downstairs bedroom, likely unknown to David at the time. Investigators suspected that David discovered this second phone after returning from disposing of the first. He must have searched for it in a panic, ransacking the room in the process, and once he found it, he accessed its voicemail and went through the contents. Evidence showed that a call was made to check the voicemail at approximately 9:55 a.m., the morning after Karen disappeared, long after her first phone had gone off the network. Once David was finished with the phone, he drove back out to the woods where he had disposed of the Verizon phone and dropped the Voyager nearby, ensuring both devices were discovered together. Before calling Karen's friends and feigning concern over her disappearance, investigators theorized that David cleaned the garage using the 7 gallons of bleach found outside the house. It was this bleach that led detectives to believe he may have sanitized the crime scene, removing any traces of evidence. David's behavior during the early days of Karen's disappearance seemed calculated to mislead those around him. He reached out to friends, neighbors, and the police, acting as though he had no idea what could have happened to his wife. But his unusual calmness and lack of active participation in search efforts raised red flags for many. In July 2023, over a decade after Karen's murder, David Swift was finally arrested in Alabama and extradited to Tennessee. He was indicted on charges of first-degree murder, though it was unclear what new evidence, if any, had emerged that prompted prosecutors to take action after so many years of silence. No new witnesses had come forward, and analysis of the phone data and forensics had remained largely stagnant since 2011. However, the case was built primarily on circumstantial evidence, which, when pieced together, painted a damning picture of David's involvement in his wife's death. As the trial began, the prosecution leaned heavily on testimonies from Karen's friends and acquaintances, who recounted numerous instances of David's controlling behavior. Some of them recounted how David stalked Karen, watching her every move, becoming increasingly paranoid about her socializing, especially with the bonus. One neighbor of Bill and Kathy Bona testified that she had caught David spying on their property from her backyard, peering into their home on multiple occasions. David, when confronted about this, claimed that the neighbor had invited him to watch what was happening at the Bonus' house, an explanation that was met with skepticism. Kathy Bona provided some of the most damning testimony, recounting how David had repeatedly confronted Karen about her alleged behavior, accusing her of infidelity and wild partying. She detailed instances where David had called Karen obsessively, monitoring her whereabouts and interrogating her about her time spent with friends. Kathy also described the night of her 40th birthday party, when Karen was found naked and passed out in the Bonus' living room after drinking heavily. Bill Bona testified that he and a friend covered Karen with a towel and contacted David to pick her up. Karen's friend Robin disputed this version of events, adding more confusion to the timeline, but the incident painted a picture of a marriage strained by jealousy and mistrust. In addition to testimony about David's behavior, the prosecution introduced evidence that David had lied about key details. One of the most significant revelations was the fact that David had called Karen's secret Voyager phone multiple times before her death, despite claiming that he had only recently discovered its existence. This was a critical point because the prosecution argued that David had been well aware of Karen's secret communications, likely with her divorce attorney, and that this knowledge had further fueled his rage. Moreover, David had claimed he was asleep between 2 a.m. and 10 a.m., the morning Karen disappeared. Yet, forensic evidence from his computer and phone showed that someone had been awake in the early hours, around 3 a.m., downloading photos of Karen, including images of her new tattoo. This contradicted his statement and raised doubts about his alibi. Additional evidence painted a picture of David's state of mind after Karen's disappearance. Despite his wife's sudden and mysterious absence, David was found to have accessed dating websites and viewed women's profiles over 250 times in the days immediately following her disappearance. This behavior, the prosecution argued, showed a lack of concern and emotional detachment from the situation, which contrasted starkly with the actions of a grieving husband. A physical therapist who had treated David for his knee injury testified that while David's mobility was restricted, he could have physically dragged Karen's body. In support of this, a neighbor testified that David had moved heavy hay bales the day before Karen disappeared, despite claiming to rely on crutches. The neighbor said that David had lifted bales weighing around 65 pounds without any visible discomfort or assistance. Yet the very next day at the police station, David seemed entirely dependent on his crutches, suggesting he may have exaggerated his injury to avoid suspicion. Despite the defense's efforts, the weight of the circumstantial evidence presented by the prosecution left little room for doubt in the minds of many. David Swift's behavior, both before and after Karen's disappearance, combined with the timeline and contradictions in his story, suggested a calculated effort to cover up his involvement in her murder. As the trial progressed, the jury would have to weigh the available evidence and testimony to determine whether David Swift had indeed taken his wife's life in a cold, premeditated act of violence, or if the years of suspicion had simply piled up against an innocent man. The prosecutor argued that in order for Karen to leave on her own, a series of highly unlikely events had to occur. First, she would have needed plans to meet someone, yet there was no evidence of any such arrangements. No texts, calls, or other indications that she intended to leave that night. More puzzling was the idea that she would have moved both of her daughters, Ashley from her own bed and Key from her husband David's bed, before sneaking out. If she was truly sneaking out, why would she take the risk of waking David by moving the children? This point seemed especially important because Karen had reportedly taken a Benadryl before going to sleep that night. Benadryl, commonly used as a sleep aid, would have made her drowsy. So why would she have deliberately taken a sedative if she had planned to leave the house within just a few hours? The defense, however, attempted to undermine all prosecutorial theories by highlighting key inconsistencies. They pointed to David's physical limitations due to his leg injury, which had required surgery both before and after Karen's death. David, according to his defense team, would not have been able to physically overpower Karen or dispose of her body. They also brought forward testimony from David and Karen's daughter Ashley, now an adult, who firmly testified that it was her mother who moved her from her bed to her sister's room that night, not her father. Ashley's testimony was clear and direct. "Yes, I remember her moving me in the middle of the night to my sister's room," she stated on the stand. When asked if she had been moved into the bed with her sister, she confirmed, "Yes." The bedroom, Ashley explained, was directly beside her parents' room, which aligned with the timeline proposed by the defense. Her account raised questions about whether David could have orchestrated the crime without waking the children or causing any noticeable disturbance. One of the weakest aspects of the prosecution's case was the lack of physical evidence. Despite extensive forensic analysis of the house, vehicles, and David himself, nothing definitive tied him to the crime. There were no signs of struggle in the house, no DNA evidence, and no fingerprints linking David to the alleged murder scene. Investigators were unable to match the rusty screw used to puncture the tire of Karen's SUV to any tool or item found in the Swift garage. David's defense lawyer seized on these weaknesses during the trial, emphasizing the lack of concrete evidence. When the jury returned from their deliberations, the outcome surprised many in the courtroom. David Swift was found not guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and attempted first- and second-degree murder. However, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on the charge of voluntary manslaughter. After hours of deliberation, they informed the judge that they were hopelessly deadlocked on this count, leaving the question of manslaughter unresolved. His legal team argued that retrying the manslaughter charge would be illegal, as the statute of limitations had already passed. However, on July 11, 2024, a judge ruled against dismissing the charge, allowing the prosecution to continue its efforts to secure a conviction. The date for the new trial has yet to be set, but it promises to reignite the legal battle.